Peter. Thanks a lot for being a part of this conversation, and it's an extreme privilege to have you as a guest. And as accomplished as you, it's something that we are really looking forward to and talking to you in the world of marketing.
Well, I appreciate the kind words and the opportunity to talk about some of my recent work. It's just great to have an audience and a really smart person to bounce ideas off of.
Thanks. So, Peter, I wanted to talk to you about how did a math major at MIT, got inspired by marketing, especially by Leigh McAllister, and I
I
think
love it.
that's a lovely story. And why don't we start there? Because normally marketing is associated with the soft skills, but here is a math major becoming a professor of marketing. So, how did it happen?
I am so glad that we're starting off with this because it's so important not only to give credit where it's due, but to acknowledge that we would not be having this conversation if it were not for that professor you mentioned, a woman named Leigh McAllister. When I was an undergraduate at MIT, a math major, as you said, loved crunching numbers, all kinds of things, whether it's sports statistics or just trivia and so on. We could talk about dollar bill numbers if we can get into that. I just love numbers and patterns. I figured I'd end up either on Wall Street or in consulting. I was even talking to folks about doing something in terms of like cryptography, actuarial science, something that a math major would go into. Well, in 1982, this marketing professor, comes up to me and says, "You ought to get a PhD in marketing." And I said to her, and she will acknowledge it, I said, "You ought to get your head checked. I'm a math guy. I'm not going into marketing." That's the last thing I would think about doing, because I had the same impression about marketing that so many other people do. But she not only was very persistent and persuasive, but she painted a picture of what she called at the time the electron microscope of the customer. We are building the electron microscope of the customer, and we need people to operate it. We need people to understand what we should be looking at, how to interpret those results, what actions we should be taking off of those results, what strategies we should develop. And she said, "And you're the guy." And I thought she was a kook. And that's where the persistence and persuasion came in. She kind of forced me to get my PhD, become a professor, and actually come to the Wharton School, even though I was very skeptical. And here I am, nearly 40 years later, thanking her every day and doing everything I can to pay it forward, to find other students who would be equally skeptical about marketing, or at least uninformed about the kinds of things that we can do, the kinds of decisions we can affect, the kinds of money that we can help create. And just every day is a joy, because that electron microscope of the customer, it works beautifully, and the insights that it provides really are life-changing.
Absolutely. The electron microscope is a great analogy to really move into our discussion around what you really have built your career and a life and purpose around, which is really customer value. I want to start asking this question, Peter. Marketing is always thought of as a very soft, uh, brilliantly, motivational. And you are somebody who talks about the hard skills of marketing. And so why is it so difficult for the traditional executive in the marketing room to really have this hard skill? And why do you think in the future this hard skill is so important for marketers?
So there's three reasons why. One is, if we just think traditionally, when we first invented marketing as we know it today, I'm thinking about, say, the late 1950s. Some folks might be familiar with the old TV series Mad Men.
Mm.
When it was all about the product, it was all about the message. We didn't have the electron microscope of the customer. And so marketing was all about branding and imagery. And really it was great. That's what really made marketing a powerful force. But unfortunately, to a large extent, we're still using the same kinds of practices as we were using back then. It's just, old habits die hard. And it's been hard for a lot of the data stuff to kind of find its way into marketing. So number one is tradition. And I guess related to that, number two would be organizational structure, that there's kind of nobody in the organization who's going to take responsibility for that electron microscope of the customer. The marketing people might, but even for them, it's often going to take a backseat to branding and customer experience and all that sort of stuff. So the idea of customers being assets just doesn't really show up anywhere. To the extent the conversation comes up at all, it's dismissed as some kind of intangible asset, and you can't really measure it or manage it. So we would never put customer information on, let's say, our 10 Qs and other auditable statements. So I think that's a big issue right there. So a variety of different reasons why it's been hard to get the customer data to break through. And that's the mission that I'm on, is to try to convince people that internally it can help us drive and call attention to more effective decisions. And externally, it's a better way to gauge what this company is doing, what its future looks like, and what it's actually worth, customer-based corporate valuation. So we're fighting those battles, and it's a long run kind of thing. It's not going to change tomorrow, but I really do believe that a lot of the practices, methodologies, concepts that I've been advocating in recent years will become commonplace. Let's wait a generation, and it will become more rule than exception. At least I hope so.
Brilliant. So, which brings me to your current work on, customer base audit. A brilliant book, I must say. I've read it, cover to cover, and I think you really talk about one very interesting aspect there, which is to say, forget the prediction, talk about simple descriptive analytics, and talk to us about it, because there's so much of hype around prediction algorithms, and you keep saying, you know what, just go for the simple stuff, think about the present, don't think about the future. So
Yep.
lovely point that you made there. So what makes you believe that's so critical?
So let's first take a step back and let's acknowledge, for folks who aren't familiar with my work, I am a forecasting guy. I love making predictions. That's what I do. That's what's the joy that I have is make predictions and be held accountable on them. But I recognize that before we come up with predictions, before we argue about models and forecasts and validation and all that stuff, let's walk before we can run. Let's look at the data that we have and really understand it. Let's have the data, excuse me, let's have the data motivate us, push us to start predicting things. So let's just look at the data. Let's be unashamedly descriptive. Let's just look at the data that we have, look for the patterns about how customers differ from each other, understand how customers change over time, all in a purely descriptive way through the 5 lenses that we describe in the book. And once you see those patterns, you can't unsee them. And once you see them, it's going to force you to say, I wonder what's going to happen next. So let me get below that observed data and start to tell a story about the true underlying propensities of people to do things and to drop out and so on. Build that model, come up with the forecast, understand how the descriptive analysis from the audit fits hand in hand with the predictive and prescriptive analyses that will come out of the models. And I think it's going to make it both easier and more important for companies to do the descriptive work and give them cover, give them resources to build the model. So it all fits well together, but man cannot live by models and forecasts alone.
Brilliant. So, which brings me to the next point that the book really talks about, uh, which is really the fact that look for the diagnostics around customer behavior. Okay, and it's so beautifully articulated, where you explain the various articulations of look at patterns, look at all the underlying behavior, and then you start looking at the persona, and therefore the data tells you a story. So why do you think it's so important for the data to tell you a story? And do you believe that data can make it creative for the marketer?
Absolutely. Oh, there's so much good stuff in that question. How am I going to pull it all apart? Got to remember it all. First of all, the patterns themselves are beautiful. When you just look at the data and look at it the right way, it's remarkable. And literally how pretty the pictures are, but maybe more importantly, how as we look over time or different groups of customers or different businesses entirely, how these patterns tend to persist. They really are like laws of nature. And I often kind of lose track of the fact that these are not laws of nature, but it's actually worthwhile to view them that way, to kind of assume that some of these patterns that we see are truth, and learning to be a little bit more humble, learning to understand that we as marketers can't change everything. That some of these patterns about how customers differ from each other, how they differ over time. So part of it is just that, is just stepping back and appreciating the beauty of nature, the nature of customers. And we started finding that early on. When I say we, I'm talking first of all about my first co-author, Bruce Hardy, who's also an incredible influence on me. When we started laying out some of these lifetime value models back in the early 2000s, it was Bruce who said, at some point we need to take a step back and really focus on this idea of a customer-based audit. So we actually came up with these words. Bruce Hardy came up with these words, I think back in 2004, saying that as we're establishing the models, that's all great, but we really should just step back and just appreciate what we could see in the data without having to do any razzle-dazzle math. And that's why I want people to kind of take the audit almost at face value like that. Before we even talk about the so what, before we even talk about the actions that we'll take and the money that we'll make, just to look at the pictures and then ask yourself, do these pictures apply to my company, to my customers? And when you see that they do, to start just appreciating that, and then start getting in deeper. And then to the rest of your question, start layering on some of the qualitative, some of the personas, some of the attitudinal questions. Once we start to understand that some customers just buy more often and spend more and stay with us a long time, and others are kind of flighty, how are they thinking about things differently? And what kinds of features and functions and messaging should we aim towards those more valuable customers? And basically that writes out the recipe for all of my work on customer centricity. Focus on the right customers for strategic advantage. But you can't do this until you first do this. And that's why even though this book comes 10 years later, it really is the first step. So both from just a pure aesthetic standpoint as well as an action standpoint, the audit, I think, is just a great starting point.
No, in fact, the way I would put it as I read the book, Peter, is that it was almost like if I go back to the healthcare business, you first have to do a diagnostics of your health. And to me, the customer-based audit is an equivalent of a diagnostics of my marketing and my customers. And therefore, the diagnostics then decides: do you want to go to a cardiologist? Do you want to go to a gynecologist? And therefore the diagnostics is really the key, and that's really where I think for the work that you have done there, it's almost like saying customer based audit is really the diagnostics of marketing. Would you agree
You
with
know,
me on that?
not only would I agree with such a marvelous metaphor, and so let's stay with it. So instead of just saying, "Oh, something hurts," let me get it checked out. Go to your doctor on a regular basis, even if you're feeling great. Make sure that you have that physical once a year, if not more often. Uh, it's an audit, and it would be great if the doctor says you're fine, nothing wrong, things are kind of moving along as they always were. It's good to know that, and your doctor is in a position to tell you about problems that you might not even be aware of as you do some of those blood tests and other diagnostic work, to give you some of those early indicators. And you don't want to wait until it hurts. So people understand that when it comes to medicine. And again, people are generally pretty good about going to the doctor. And then we turn to the financial audit, which is another good metaphor. In that case, no one wants to do the financial audit. It's like, oh, we have to, we got to do it. We got to collect all that data. But you know what? It's good for you. It's not only a legal requirement, but not only the outcome of the audit, but even the process of doing the financial audit can help you uncover some irregularities or just some business processes that need some fine tuning. Same exact thing with your customer base. So we can come up with so many metaphors for it, yet this is a domain where it very rarely happens. We don't do any of these kinds of activities until something is hurting and we have a crisis to solve. We need to change that.
Absolutely. And therefore, the fact that you need to do a yearly medical checkup is really the way the yearly customer base audit has to be done. And that's really what the book really talks about, right?
It really is that simple. And again, the best audit would be the uninteresting one, where things are just moving along. That's great. And instead of just ignoring that or simply checking the box internally, there's going to be some messaging there to share with your investors and your other stakeholders to say, look, no news is good news, and we're going to show it to you. So it's more than just a check the box thing. There's going to be headlines in the audit, even if there are no headlines in the audit, if you catch my drift. And I just want to see companies doing it regularly for all kinds of beneficial reasons.
So, coming back to certain businesses know their customers by name. I would call it the PII data, but there are this whole host of businesses like the CPG business where I really don't know my customers. So, how do I look at customer base audit for a business where my tertiary data is something that I don't get, and therefore, how do you really apply customer base audit for such companies where billions of dollars are being invested on marketing?
A fantastic question, one that's very difficult to answer. We try. And that's why before we even get into any of the diagnostic stuff in the book, we first have this long conversation about who is the customer? Is it a distinct individual? Is it a family unit? Is it a neighborhood? Or on the B2B side, is it the person, the procurement person who's actually buying the product? Or is it the executive who's using it? Or is it a group? Is it the company as a whole? These are hard questions to answer. And I wish I could say, read the book and you'll have the answers to them. And no, it's not that simple. But at least having that conversation, coming up with some agreement on an enterprise-wide basis about who or what is the customer. We think about all the time, the metaphor for the data would be that the rows in our spreadsheet are the customers and the columns are the activities they're doing over time. How do we define those rows? And in different settings, like let's say in pharmaceuticals, is it the patient? Is it the physician? Is it the insurance company? Is it the distributor? Is it the pharmacy chain? So let's at least get agreement on it before we move ahead. And that's going to not only help us collect the data properly and do the audit properly, but just have better aligned decision making and accountability. So really important to figure that out, or at least, again, come up with what rules we're going to use to determine it before we even do anything with data. Now, to the main point of your question, there are a lot of companies out there that can't tag and track every individual. And so that's going to help drive who the choice of the customer might be. And so maybe we should do it at kind of one level higher. So maybe, for instance, if we are a CPG manufacturer, instead of the individual customer who we can't tag and track, maybe it's going to be the store. That's fine. That will be the customer. And indeed, that's the way a company like Procter and Gamble talks about its customers. They know that their customers are Walmart and Asda and so on, instead of particular individuals. But it's changing. the electron microscope of the customer is making it possible to tag and track individuals much more effectively than ever before. And it's only a matter of time before, even in the faceless, nameless CPG world, we'll be able to do that on a regular basis. So we need to be prepared for it.
Brilliant. So when you're in a contractual setting, I read the research papers that you've published for so many years versus a non-contractual setting, right? So therefore, the real challenge in a non-contractual setting is really the fact that I'm not bound to have a relationship with you as a customer, and therefore I tend to be flirting with brands, versus in a contractual relationships I can't flirt because of the relationship that is pretty much locked in. So given this, when I do customer based audit, would you discount these factors when you do customer based audit, and
Oh,
would that be a part of the overall working in the customer based audit?
so let's first talk about that distinction because it is so vital. When we talk to companies about, if you had to split businesses up, usually they'd say B2B versus B2C or products versus services. Now, the distinction you just described, contractual or non-contractual, is so critical. And the reasons why the non-contractual world is so difficult is not merely the absence of a contract. There's actually three reasons why. First of all, there's latent attrition. You never know if that customer's gone. All you know is that they haven't bought from you in a while. And so you'll never know for sure whether they're gone, but you can come up with a probability. What's the probability that they'll ever buy from me again? So what's the probability that they're still alive as a customer? So problem number one is the idea of latent attrition, which in the contractual world, it's easy. I had a contract, I churn, I'm gone. Easy. Problem number two would be the timing of the purchases. That in the contractual setting, the purchases, the interactions tend to be very regular. Every month I pay my subscription fee. But in the non-contractual setting, let's say you're moving to a new house, so you go to the kind of home store to buy boxes and things to pack, and then you go to buy new furniture, and then you don't visit the store again for another 2 years. Doesn't mean that you're gone as a customer. It just means that you don't have needs for it at the moment. So the timing of the purchases is much different. And finally, the size of the purchases. In the contractual setting, you spend pretty much the same amount of money on that magazine or that insurance policy or that telco subscription. Whereas when it comes to buying in a non-contractual setting, sometimes you're spending thousands, sometimes you're spending very little. It's a mess. And it needs the audit even more than the contractual. And that's why the main example in this book is a non-contractual one. And we admit that. And in the back end, we talk about how things would be different for the contractual setting. And we acknowledge that it will actually be much easier. Back of the envelope calculations, like a retention rate, can get you pretty far in the contractual setting, but there's no equivalent of that in the non-contractual because you don't know whether the customer is with you or not. So it's much more challenging, much more difficult, but therefore more important to be doing the audit in that kind of non-contractual setting.
So when you're really talking about non-contractual setting, so does the work that you have done on customer-based valuation makes a lot of sense? Because I'm a CEO of a large CPG company. I know that my shares and stock prices are based on valuations, and suddenly when you really do customer-based valuations for non-contractual relationships. So I'm a CPG company. I know that I sell so many tons of soap, so many tons of shampoo, but literally, if I'm able to retain those customers on a day over and month over and year over basis, my evaluations become far more larger. And therefore, is that something that the non-contractual company should be looking at and start working on customer-based valuations?
I love it. Of course, the answer is yes. I love the way you set that up. A lot of my recent work has been on this idea of customer-based corporate valuation, taking the same descriptives that we'll see in the audit, taking the same models of lifetime value that I alluded to before. And instead of just stopping with the marketing people and saying, hey, you ought to send this message to that customer. I mean, I love doing that kind of thing. But let's go a step further. Let's talk to the people in finance. And basically, if we can project customer acquisition, retention, repeat purchase, and spend, we can do a better job of projecting revenue and free cash flow over a longer horizon with a better diagnostic understanding of why revenues are leveling off. And basically do a better job of valuing the company, understanding the stock price, and turning around to come up with immediate actions of things that we can do to maintain our momentum or to raise our overall valuation to a higher level. It's been, for me personally, so much fun, so interesting to enter this brave new world of finance. Again, I'm a marketing professor. But the fact that some of my finance colleagues, both academics and practitioners, start to care what I have to say is wonderful. I mean, the Financial Times just offered some praise for the new book. And that, wow, that's dream come true that most marketers won't have happen. So for me, I'm a marketing professor. I'm never going to give that up. Having impact on finance is a way is not an end unto itself, although it would be for a lot of people. For me, it's if I can get the finance people on board, it's going to give me more respect, more resources, more alignment with the marketing people, so we can go ahead and do our marketing things with more confidence and with better support.
Absolutely. So, given the fact that it's so, I would say, looks common sense, why do companies find it hard to get this in their culture, in their DNA? Because they just seem to be moving with averages, moving with, I would call it painting the picture, but not really getting to the granular, customer-based, work. So why is it so difficult for companies to do it?
It goes back to what we discussed before, kind of tradition, organizational structure, and just some either maybe skepticism's too strong a word, but disbelief that the electron microscope of the customer can actually drive value. That first of all, that it exists and that we can really understand it in a granular way. Too many companies, even if they have all that data, they say, "Oh, our customers constantly changing. Whether it's COVID, whether it's recessions, whether it's new products that we're launching or that our competitors are launching, our markets are being constantly disrupted. That there's just nothing. There's nothing kind of. There's nothing." Comparable within our customers. There's nothing we can learn because everything's changing. Well, that's not true. And again, that's the beauty of some of these patterns. If you kind of forget about all of that noise for a moment, do the audit and do it again next quarter and next year, and you start to see the regularity of the patterns. It's wonderful because it lets you kind of turn off some of that noise and kind of focus on what's there. So, my encouragement is don't knock it till you try it. just just
Absolutely.
just don't believe all of that hype. Don't believe all of that nonsense. Just do the audit, see for yourself, and in many cases, you'll see the kind of stability that I've referred to. And to the extent that you see differences, you'll first of all have a baseline to understand the magnitude of those differences. You'll have some diagnostic understanding of why those differences are arising and what actions you should take to either combat them or to lean into them. The audit gives you all that.
So, which brings me to the most important point of this conversation, which is therefore, when I do the customer based audit, do you believe time has come for companies to add a customer P&L to balance sheets?
I absolutely believe that, and I've come about it kind of indirectly, and it's been a long journey for me. I used to say things that, in hindsight, are terribly naive. That we should calculate customer lifetime value and put that future asset value of our customers, put that on the balance sheet. No, we can't do that. You can't put forecasts, estimates on a balance sheet like that. It just make no sense. You can't audit that like you can actual observable customer behavior. And we have seen some companies do it. And when I say we, in this case, once again, giving credit where it's due, is another one of my former PhD students, Dan McCarthy. See, Dan used to be a hedge fund guy and then came back to Wharton, where he had been an undergraduate, to get his PhD. And all of this work we're doing on customer-based corporate evaluation, it was his dissertation work. And I have learned so much from him about how to take these models, how to take these metrics, how to take the audit and frame them in a way to get the finance people to care and to start to really push the idea of disclosing formal, auditable customer metrics. And I hope that the folks who are watching and listening to this, first thing you got to do, don't connect with me. I mean, do that too. But connect with Dan McCarthy. Because what he does is he reads the statements that companies are saying about themselves, about their customers, or what external folks are saying about it, Wall Street analysts and so on, and looking at them through this proper lens to understand what is the health of the customer base, what is the health of the business, and what are the drivers that are either preventing them from being more valuable or that would allow them to do so. And we've been on a letter writing campaign along with Rob Markey, Bain Consulting, the Net Promoter Score guy, to try to get financial accounting standards boards to demand or at least set guidelines for customer metrics about acquisition, retention, and development. And here's what you should disclose. Here are the caveats about it based on what kind of company you are. We're seeing more and more lawsuits about this, all kinds of litigation about either the presentation of customer metrics or the failure to do so. And on one hand, I kind of love those lawsuits because it's creating more scrutiny. It's forcing us to be a little bit more specific. On the other hand, if we had these standards out there, then there wouldn't be as many arguments about it. So that is absolutely the future. And again, it's going to be a long time before we get there, but we are going to look back 20 years from now and say, what were we thinking? How did we not have this stuff in place? Businesses will operate more effectively. Stakeholders will know what they're buying and how all those investments are performing. Regulators will benefit from it as well. And therefore, just overall social welfare will be improved by having a greater transparency about customer behavior.
So, which brings me to the question of customer centricity, because once you do customer based audit, because it's very fashionable to talk about customer centricity today, and without actually having the metrics or the audit in place. And it's because it's great to talk about digital transformation, talk about customer centricity. So if you were to really look back and then say, here is a math guy turned into a marketing professor looking at customer centricity, what would be your blueprint of customer centricity?
So I stand by my blueprint of customer centricity, the idea that not all customers are created equal. And here we go again, that if we can focus on the right customers for strategic advantage, we'll make more money in a sustainable, defendable, ethical manner. And so I love everything we say about it, but the issue is, how do we get going with it? And it's kind of nice that some companies just kind of take my word for granted and say, well, let's just do it. But I kind of like the ones who are skeptical and the ones who kind of push back and say, prove to me that not all customers are created equal. Prove to me what are the patterns over time that we need to take advantage of. And again, that's why the audit is the first step. Now, if I had written this book first, it might not have the same impact and reception that it has when I first kind of get people all juiced up and jazzed up. Customer centricity, rah, rah, let's do it. So the first book, even though in some sense is a sequel to the third book, very confusing, it was a great way to get people to wake up and start asking the right questions and aspiring to do a certain kind of thing and basically saying, so how do we do it? And that's where the audit comes in, and that's where lifetime value comes in. So sometimes kind of starting at the top, starting with the North Star before we kind of map out the whole journey is the more effective way to go. But, once you want to begin the journey, you got to make sure that you have the right map And I think the audit provides that.
So, assuming that the audit provides me that, and if I were to build a customer blueprint, the way I then need to re-engineer certain functions in the organization would be very different, right? So, for example, if all customers are not equal, all customer service is not equal, all sales is not equal, all marketing is not equal, right? And therefore, then how do I really re-engineer my org? Okay, if I were the CEO of the company, and that is a big transformation waiting in its wings to be done, right?
And it's so hard. And of course, I am not an organizational transformation guy, although I have to say, exactly to your point, as I've learned about these challenges and have started to kind of lay out in broad strokes what it is a company needs to do, you need to organize around the customers instead of the products. I've developed much more appreciation for that work. There's a marvelous book by a gentleman named Jay Galbraith called Designing the Customer-Centric Organization. And it's beautiful, because I encourage people to pick up a copy of that book, because some of the challenges that he lays out, some of the changes that need to be made, align so well with everything I've been saying. How do we focus on some customers? How do we do that organizationally? How do we develop the right culture around it? And so there are ways to do that. I'm just starting to learn that now. In fact, I'm already starting to think about book number 4, the 5 C's, creating a customer-centric corporate culture. So the Galbraith book tells you how to lay out the organizational design. But even that isn't going to get you success unless you have the right culture in place. And there's all of this great work, again, by colleagues that I'm not one of them. I'm not a culture guy. But a lot of people have written great books on creating effective corporate culture. But so often it's how do we build the right culture around the product, around the stuff that we sell and the stuff that we deliver. I'm not saying that the work is irrelevant for a customer-based organization. A lot of it does transfer over, but there's a lot that is different, and a lot we need to add into the mix to develop a customer-centric corporate culture. So we're in early stages of that, and it's been just like my foray into finance through my new company Theta. It's just great to be learning. It's just great to be getting some perspective on areas of research and practice that not only have I known nothing about, but 5 or 10 years ago I would have said, why would I want to learn about it? And that's the great thing about being a professor, is being surrounded by smart people who like to collaborate. And I'm hoping that I can continue to learn and continue to contribute through these allied areas that are near but distinct from marketing.
So you also said you're not just a descriptive analytics guy, but you're also a forecasting guy. And therefore, when I look back at marketing measurement, okay, marketing mix is talked about a lot. Given now that you have done customer based audit and not all customers are equal, do you believe the fundamentals of even market mix modeling needs to change given this phenomenal stuff that you have done around customers?
Yes, yes, yes. And it's a very important statement, because earlier in my career, as we were just in the process of building the electron microscope, really for the first 10 or 15 years of my career, when I was working mostly with packaged goods firms. So we did not have the kind of granularity that we want. It was very product oriented, did a lot of marketing mix modeling and things like that. But it was the late 1990s. It really was a combination of the beginning of the dot-com era, where we could start to tag and track customers, and just kind of natural curiosity on my part and the part of Bruce Hardy and others to basically see whether these patterns that we first observe in the packaged goods world, do they apply elsewhere? Do they apply to, for instance, sports, media, entertainment, healthcare? And they do. It was at that point, right around the turn of the century, where we kind of made that pivot from developing these models at the service of selling more product to gaining better customer understanding and all of the stuff we've been talking about. And a lot of the kinds of models that were good when we take the product focus, marketing mix modeling, aren't as effective today, because the customers are massively different from each other. And it's not enough just to say, okay, here's our media budget. How should we allocate it? We should be doing that differently for different groups of customers. So I'm not saying that say MMM is completely useless, but the way that we tend to use it as at this broad corporate level instead of doing it kind of in a more customer centric manner. So yes, a lot of the metrics, a lot of the models. I mean, even the North Star metric for most companies, market share. If you think about the origins of market share, very product centric. It's because back in the 1920s, Arthur C. Nielsen, yeah, the TV guy who invented market share, that was the only thing they could measure is, how many cans of beans were on the shelf last week, how many were on the shelf this week, and what is it for the other companies? Very product-centric measure, which isn't nearly as useful in the customer-centric world. We need new metrics, we need new organizational structures, and again, we need new disclosures for our stakeholders. It all fits together, but it's very, very challenging to do.
So, having seen the era before .com and having seen the era with AI and technology being there today, how do you see the marketing department of the future?
Well, I'm an old school kind of guy, even though I'm doing all this new stuff. And for years and years, as I was learning these practices, going through this pivot that I described in the late 1990s, I found that the sector, or say the part of the organization that did this stuff best, was direct marketing. Old school direct marketing, where they'd send you a postcard in the mail and say, would you want to buy this product? And we all are familiar with direct marketing. We tend to associate it with schlocky products and annoying advertisements. And I'm not going to comment on that. But if you look behind the scenes, below the surface, they understood that not all customers were created equal. They understood that if we could figure out who the best customers are and then use them to determine what kinds of products we should develop instead of the usual product first approach. So a lot of what I've been espousing is taking some of that old school direct marketing and kind of dusting it off and finding ways to do it better, faster, and more impactfully through digital marketing and machine learning and so on. So, you look at the books behind me over there, you'll see all these, well, you probably can't see them, but a lot of books on direct marketing, really terribly out of vogue for people who are doing things with, TikTok and Instagram and whatever else. But all these firms, it really is just direct marketing. And so let's learn from our forefathers and use that kind of data and those channels more effectively. And again, combining with the digital capabilities that we have today, very powerful combination.
So, therefore, I did see that interview of yours where you really thought about it. So, do you see the fusion of direct and indirect marketing?
So direct marketing is so out of vogue that when I say the kind of statement I just said, read those old books, no one's going to do that. And so what I want to do instead, and really so much of what I did in the first book, without saying, be a direct marketer, once or twice maybe. Let's pretend it's something new. Like, hey, we have all of this new stuff out there that didn't exist before. And that makes it a little bit shinier, and that makes it a little bit more tolerable, a little bit more, it invokes a little bit more curiosity. So let's just basically take old direct marketing and kind of warm it over and call it something new, customer centricity, and then weave it in with other contemporary marketing practices. And so that's kind of what I've been doing. It's maybe a little bit, dishonest, but at least I admit that I'm doing it. And I just want to get people to be willing to pay attention to what was going on with direct marketing back in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, because that stuff is still very powerful and applicable today.
Fantastic. So, which brings me to the end of our conversations, and I have some rapid fire questions for you. The first question Professor Peter Fader, is what does success mean to you?
Well, what does it mean to me personally?
Yeah.
It means waking up in the morning and looking forward to whatever I have in front of me. Just whether it's work, whether it's play, whether it's family, just enjoying what you're doing, feeling satisfied with how you're doing it, have wonderful people around you who appreciate what you do, again, personally and professionally. That's success. Can money buy you that? I don't know, but I wake up every day just eager to teach, to consult, to do research. And again, going back to my fairy godmother, Lee McAllister, I'm the luckiest man and the most successful man on the planet because of the joy that I find in what I do.
Great answer. Great answer. My next question is, given that you've had such a long career, if you go back and reflect, what's one single piece of best advice that you ever got?
Well, of course, the advice from McAllister: get that PhD in marketing. I wish that I was more open to it. I mean, I did it, I listened, but it was more kind of against my will. She made me. Um, I wish I leaned into it earlier and more willingly. Again, things have worked out wonderfully well, but when I'm working with students, I instead of fighting with them, instead of dragging them by their hair to go into this field, I want to make them understand why it's going to make their life interesting, even though they would have never thought about this before. So I think so. I guess the answer to the question then is first of all, be willing to take some bold steps. But seek kind of guidance and mentorship along the way to make sure you're on the right path and pursuing it the right way.
Brilliant. Uh, if you were to give a piece of advice to an 18-year-old in a university, what would be that advice?
Oh, that's there. It's going to be very specific and it's going to be very tangible. Um, well, especially if you have some kind of quantitative leaning, you need to get a nice variety of technical skills. I mean, everyone talks about AI and machine learning, and there's no doubt that that's part of the portfolio, but it's not the only. And in fact, it might not even be the biggest part. So there's going to be other kinds of technical skills you need to pick up. So a lot of the work that I do, I mentioned in passing before that I was thinking of being an actuary. The people come up with the insurance rates. That's basically what I do. It's more about probability and statistics than it is about AI and machine learning. So you want to take a bunch of courses on that, again, old school, just how we do probability and statistics. And then we also want to do a little bit of econometrics. So the kinds of work. Anyway, so it's a variety of different technical skills. We want to have this broad platform. And then besides just the technical stuff, there's just, I want people to be really analytical. I want them to be able to ask the right questions, to be able to harness, to be resourceful about how to approach them. I wanted them to be able to argue and persuade. And so if you notice, a lot of things that I'm saying would tend to be a more liberal arts education than a business education. Here I am, professor in a business school, but I'd rather people study math or philosophy or things that are just going to help them think and analyze broadly rather than worrying about all of those downstream applications. That stuff's going to be easy to learn later on, but you want to make sure that you have the right foundation to be able to pursue it.
Great. So, what's one thing that you believe in, Professor Peter Fader, that others don't believe in whatever you say?
So when I'm building my models and when I look at the world, I believe that there's a lot of things happening, especially with customers, as if randomly. This is a really important point, because too often we give either our customers too much credit and we kind of overcomplicate their decision process, or we as outside observers looking at them try to attribute everything that they're doing. Why are they turning left? Why are they turning right? Why are they going straight? And in many cases, it's as if they're acting randomly. They're flipping a coin, they're rolling a die, they're spinning a wheel. So rather than trying to explain every little thing that's going on, again, let's be humble. Let's have that humility to say there's certain things that we just can't explain. And let's view them through an as if random mechanism. I tell my students on the first day of class that not only do I want to teach you a bunch of technical skills, but I want to change the way you look at the world. And I want you to see everything, not just customer behavior, not just business, but whether it's the spread of a pandemic, whether it's sports, whether it's politics, you name it, as the outcome of an as if random process. And if you can just understand both the nature of that random process, but also the limitations of just of how much we can explain, you'll live a better life. You'll make better decisions, and it's just inherently more interesting to view things that way.
So it's almost like saying add a bit of irrationality to the rationality you
Well, I'm going to jump in and say I don't even like talking about irrationality. Irrationality. This is one of the concerns I have with economics. That kind of our baseline feelings that people are rational, and then we have all of this work on behavioral economics. It was wait a
Mm,
minute, no, they're not. And I'm just agnostic about the whole thing. I'm basically saying people aren't rational, but they're not irrational either. They're
yeah.
just flipping coins and rolling dice and spinning wheels to
Yeah.
decide when to buy, how often to buy, and so on. So I'm not making any claims about stuff like that. Again, having said that, it's still important to learn economics and be respectful of it because it is a natural mindset that a lot of people have. But I rarely invoke anything like rationality or irrationality in my work. For me, it's all actuarial science, coin flips, and so on.
Brilliant. If you were to invite uh, a few people for a dream dinner, who would they be and who would you love to have on the table?
Well, this is going to sound terribly corny, but I mean it sincerely. Albert Einstein.
Okay.
I go back to what I just said about things acting as if randomly. Einstein had this very famous quote saying, God isn't playing dice with the universe.
Hmm.
I kind of disagree with him on that. Now, who am I to tell Albert Einstein what to do? But I'd love to have that conversation. When he was doing his work, it was just when things like quantum physics, quantum mechanics were just being born. He was skeptical about that stuff. I wonder what he would think about it now. So there's Albert Einstein because what he did to come up with a very simple model of the universe that today, 120 years later, we're still truly viewing as if it's true, even though it's just a theory. I'd love to talk to him. And then the two gentlemen who first took a lot of the techniques that I develop and first popularized them both within the field of marketing and in practice. One, a gentleman named Andrew Ehrenberg,
Hmm.
fascinating person, who basically was the first in marketing to lay out a lot of these patterns, to do things kind of like an audit. Some of the folks watching this program might be familiar with the work of Byron Sharp down at the University of South Australia. Everything that he's doing is just an homage to Andrew Ehrenberg. Fascinating guy. I did have the pleasure and privilege of having a lot of conversations with him before he passed away, but there's still a lot more to talk about. And then last and maybe least familiar would be a gentleman named Don Morrison, who is still alive, a retired professor at UCLA, who did just great work to basically take some of the kinds of things that Ehrenberg first observed, come up with the statistical models, and kind of bring them into marketing. A lot of my lifetime value work are models that he and some of his former PhD students, including one of my former beloved colleagues, Dave Schmidtlein, who's now
Mhm.
dean at the Sloan School at MIT, first brought into the field. And all I've been doing is standing on their shoulders to take their models and add bells and whistles and talk more about the so what and popularize them and make them more accessible. So there you go. Hey, Dave, you can come to dinner too. So Dave, Don, Andrew, and Albert. I could go on
Brilliant.
for days, but I really do. Even though I get a lot of credit for this stuff, I recognize that it's just the people who did the work previously and who I've had the ability to collaborate with and who have made all of this possible.
Brilliant. Now that you know a little bit about the ContraMinds podcast, Peter, if you were to think of a guest who you believe you would want to listen, who would that be?
Well, if you notice, a lot of what I've said is academic, 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 even though I get outside of the ivory tower myself and form these companies and so on. But there's a number of people who have been amazing, who have been willing to, read the papers and understand the science, but at the same time, they're firmly grounded in the real world. And so here's two of them. One of them is a gentleman named Neil Hoyne. He's at Google, and he's remarkable about his ability to take what we do and translate it into the practical. So his book, sitting over there, the yellow
Converted.
covered one, Converted. There you go.
Converted.
And then and Zachary Anderson, who was so inspirational to me when he was the chief data analytics officer at Electronic Arts, the gaming company, now in the same role with NatWest Bank in the UK. Again, discovering some of these things on his own, doing an amazing job of getting people within the organization to buy into it, as we were discussing, doing that more effectively than anyone else I've ever dealt with. I mean, I could go on again with many others, but Neil and Zachary have been remarkable about their abilities to get this stuff done inside companies and to get others to really appreciate and want to do it.
Brilliant. So we already have had Neil on the show, and so that's brilliant. And he's the one who gave us that you should talk to Peter Feder, and that's really how the connections happened. So therefore, thanks a lot, and brilliant having a conversation with you. It was inspiring, extremely refreshing. Your points of view on marketing completely something that really aligns with some of the thoughts that I had being a direct marketer myself, and then I moved into data and analytics. I believe what you've said is absolute truth. And thanks a lot, and lovely talking to you.
And wonderful talking to you too. I'm inviting you to that dinner as well, because I love the questions you've been asking, the fact that you've done your homework so carefully and doing such a wonderful job of getting all these ideas out there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Peter.